Welcome to The Spiritual Life. I'm Father Jim Martin. On this podcast, we reflect on how people experience God in their prayer and their daily lives. And I am joined by my wonderful producer, Maggie Van Dorn. Maggie, good to be with you again.
It's good to be with you, Jim. Who are we speaking with this week?
We are very excited to speak with Anthea Butler, who I met first online. I really was taken by actually her tweets, which were very thoughtful and grounded and challenging. And then when I found out she was teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, my alma mater, I was even more interested and then met her in person. And she's just fantastic. But tell us a little bit more about Anthea, Maggie.
Dr. Anthea Butler is a professor of American social thought and the chair of religious studies at the University of Pennsylvania.
Go Quakers.
She specializes in African American religious history, evangelicalism, Pentecostalism, and the intersections of religion, race, and politics. Her books include White Evangelical Racism and Women in the Church of God in Christ. Anthea has contributed to the 1619 Project from the New York Times, which is also an incredible podcast, definitely worth checking out. And she is a regular columnist for MSNBC. Anthea was awarded the 2022 Martin E. Marty Award for the Public Understanding of Religion and is president-elect of the American Society for Church History. We have a great conversation with Anthea that we're going to share in just a minute. But first, Jim, I would like to get to our audience question. So this question comes from Mary, and Mary asks, how can one align their faith and practice as Jesus so clearly did in the Gospels?
Well, Mary, thanks for that question. The first thing is we can't do it as clearly and as well and as perfectly as Jesus did. So that's the first thing. So we need to kind of cut ourselves some slack a little bit, but not too much slack, because I think what's interesting about the Gospels is that there's some parts of the Gospels that are, a little hard to understand. What did Jesus mean by this parable or this particular Aramaic practice, right, or first century practice in Judea or Galilee? But a lot of the stuff he was pretty clear on, right? Being loving, merciful, compassionate, forgiving, that's a tough one. And especially caring for those people who are poor, who are sick, who are marginalized in any way, who are suffering. Matthew 25 is often seen as the litmus test for entrance into the reign of God. And that is, Jesus saying, when I was a stranger, you visited me. When I was sick, you cared for me. When I was homeless, you housed me. And, it's pretty clear. You don't have to be a rocket scientist or a New Testament scholar to know what Jesus is asking. So I would just say, do your best and follow what Jesus not only did in the Gospels, but also said that we should do in the Gospels.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I would only add to it that just as we are to treat the excluded and outcast and marginalized in society, that we also show that kind of love and compassion towards the parts of ourselves that might feel excluded and marginalized and outcast. And that somehow I think those two are connected. Absolutely.
Absolutely. It's loving ourselves, loving God, and loving neighbor.
Right.
And Anthea gives a great answer to that question. It's really well worth waiting for. So thanks, Mary. Thanks for that great question, and I hope it helps.
And if any of you would like to ask Father Jim a question, you can write to us at thespirituallife@americamedia.org.
And now a word from our sponsor. Looking for a simple way to deepen your own spiritual life? Give Us This Day is a superb resource that helps Catholics stay rooted in both Scripture and prayer, wherever you are, no matter how busy you are. It features both reliable and relatable spiritual reflections, the daily readings, essays on the lives of the saints, and of course, prayers to accompany you throughout the day. I'm honored to be an editorial advisor, and I've been writing a monthly essay called Teach Us to Pray from the very beginning, and I use it every single day. It's a great resource. And here's a great offer right now. Listeners of The Spiritual Life can get 10% off their new print subscription, and I have to say, the booklets are beautiful. Just visit giveusthisday.org/spirituallife and join our community of Catholics praying together. Again, that's giveusthisday.org/spirituallife. Now on to our conversation with Anthea Butler. So Anthea Butler, welcome to The Spiritual Life.
Thank you, Father Martin.
I'm so happy to have you here. I have so many questions. First of all, you were raised Catholic, but practiced evangelicalism for a time. Can you just walk us through that, your family of origin, your Catholic faith, and what that was like?
Well, this will be a good story. I think a lot of people don't really understand Black Catholics in America sometimes. So let me talk about it from a historical perspective first, and I can tell you why I ended up the way I did. Grew up in Texas. My mother's from Louisiana. As far as we can tell, we're fourth generation Black Catholic. And the reason why we're Catholic on my mother's side is because of slavery. Obviously, they came through the port of New Orleans. The court of Noir said in 7 days, if you are Catholic and you buy a slave, you have to baptize them. Now, that didn't mean you got, the sacraments or anything. You might get the sacraments once a year. You might get communion. It's very rare that people got, confirmation or anything because the priest had to go around from different plantations, right? So I know we're starting off heavy, but
no, it's interesting. Yeah.
It's very interesting. So I grew up very Catholic with a Catholic grandmother who, she was watched ETWN all the time, Eternal Word. I grew up listening to Mother Angelica and prayed the rosary all the time. When we had funerals, it was, the rosary and everything. And the Catholic church that we went to, this will be the connection to our new Pope, was on the bayou in St. Martinville, Louisiana. That Catholic church was started by Catherine Drexel.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And she started the school first, and then it was the Catholic Church, because at the time in St. Martinville, there's only one Catholic church. And so when there were both Black and white people going in that church, that parish, Black people could not participate in the sodalities. You couldn't do the altar cloths. You couldn't do anything. But when that Catholic Church came, then it was a way in which Black women, men could participate, okay? St. Martinville is also the place where, I know you're going, I can't believe we're starting off with this much history. It's also the place where you had one of the first Black Society for Divine Word priests. They were first cohort in the 1920s. They had a priest there, maybe 1932, 34, okay? So that's what my mother grew up with. And every summer we would go to church down there. And about when I was 10, I looked around and said, well, there's a lot of white people in this church. And my mother goes, they're not white, they're Creoles. It was all Black church. But to me, they all looked like you. And I didn't know the difference. I'm darker skinned, they're lighter skinned, but I didn't realize who they were. So it was very interesting because I had two forms of Catholicism. One was my Louisiana Catholicism growing up, and then the Catholicism growing up in Texas where you were the minority and you'd be out on Sunday in 45 minutes to an hour, and all the rest of your friends were not at the restaurant because they were in church for 3 or 4 hours because they're all Baptist, right? So that was interesting. My dad, I always thought before he told us this, converted because he wanted to marry my mother because he grew up Baptist. But that was not the case. When he was 17, he converted because a family down the street from him asked him to go to Mass. And he said, I didn't like all the screaming they did in the Baptist church. And so when he went to the Air Force in California, believe it or not, he started talking to a Catholic priest there, and that's how he became Catholic. So when they both got married, they were both Catholic. And that's how I got here and went to Catholic school. So that's part one. So I got to tell the rest of the part, but I had to tell this history because if I just tell you I'm Catholic, it doesn't mean anything. But if I tell you the history, it's a very big history.
No, it's so interesting. You're embedded in that culture. And so let me get this straight. So the parishes in Texas, were they predominantly white?
No, in Louisiana.
In Louisiana,
this is where
right.
I spent my summers with my grandmother, right? But in Texas, we had a white congregation. So let's think about post-Vatican II. So this was my experience in, I will not name the parish because it'll pick on them, but in this particular parish that I grew up in, when we started doing the sign of peace, you would look around and hope that the white person would shake your hand. And maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. But I also went to Catholic school there. So we had, at the time that I was going to Catholic school, we had both nuns and we had, lay people, right? And so that was kind of an interesting thing because I had been used to seeing nuns when I go home in the summer, in the parish in Louisiana, but coming back to Texas, it was already a mix of, right? So it's very interesting how that happened. And I also went to CCD all you Catholics out here will know what that is. I went to CCD, but probably the reason why I am the way I am is because I asked too many questions at CCD and they didn't know how to answer them.
That's good. Would you have considered yourself a religious kid?
Yes. I mean, I was always reading stuff. I mean, it was either Lives of the Saints or something. I had a lot of questions about the Mass, right? So yes, in that sense, religious, right? Because I paid attention. It was the popes or whatever. Because I was around people who were very religious and very pious in that Catholic way. And I think we don't think about that sometimes, about how different people of ethnic groups have their piety. We, in Texas, we think about, the Mexican population or whatever. But people didn't think about Louisiana Catholics that way because it was like, oh, you all are just into crawfish and Zydeco dancing, right? But it was something very different for us because it was a part of our lives. And very much a part of, you could look and talk to somebody and say, well, I come from this parish, and people would know each other. So it was very interconnected.
Yeah, it's a certain kind of Catholicism, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the cultural Catholicism in different parts of the country, they're so unique, and kind of beautiful. And I think when you are introduced to one, you can say, well, this whole world that I didn't know existed. Now, I didn't want to get to this so soon, but that must have been exciting when you heard about Pope Leo's background.
Absolutely. I was so excited because all of us, well, most of us, and this is very interesting, this is a secret, some of us who grew up that way knew when we looked at him what was up. Now, this may sound very strange to people, but there's something you just know. It's like a knowing inside of you. So we knew he's Creole. And that was really interesting. And then when everything started coming out about his family, then it was like this thing. And my friend who lived in New Orleans was actually the first person while I was in Rome who told me, and I started looking and everybody was talking about it. Oh, he's from the 7th Ward and this is great and blah, blah, blah. So there's a sense of pride, I think, for Louisiana Catholics about this, especially Southern Louisiana Catholics. Yeah.
I mean, I know the name Prevost would be French, but I was surprised and delighted.
Yeah,
he's so, I mean, in a sense, it's such an American story.
Yeah, it very much is.
So you're a religious girl and young woman. How long would you say that lasted with Catholicism?
The first 25 years before I moved to Los Angeles. And then it was hard because basically what happened was I found myself in a situation where I didn't like any of the parishes. It wasn't very friendly. And I had friends who were evangelicals. Let me be specific about this. Pentecostals who were, come to church with us, blah, blah, blah. And, it's that thing where John Wesley says your heart feels strangely warmed. And, in Catholicism, sometimes you're singing those hymns and you're just like, this is the driest thing on earth. God, I'm not feeling anything. And I felt something. And I was like, I feel compelled to go for the altar call, right? And I did, and I started getting very involved in this church, and that's what led me to go to seminary. And, I thought, erroneously, that I would be a counselor because I thought, I want to help people, blah, 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 but I don't have that kind of counseling personality. My personality is more like, you messed that up, you need to fix this. So I didn't have that kind of personality, but what was good about me going to seminary is that I think what had been the disconnect for me in my Catholicism growing up was that I got the Catholicism of practice. I didn't get the Catholicism of intellect. And when you have somebody who's asking you a lot of questions and the priest can't answer your questions and the sisters tell you to shut up, then you lose your thing. And, evangelicals were like, well, just read scripture. I hadn't read the Bible before. And I started thinking about all these things. You think about the languages you can learn and all of this. And that really changed me. But it also was the thing that brought me back. And that's the interesting part, was that going this route wasn't a route that, made me leave Catholicism altogether. And that happens with a lot of people. For me, it was the route that helped me to figure out where my spirituality was and what I needed. And for me, it was more like lectio divina. It was more like I need to read. I need to think about things. I need to inquire and question. Because if you don't question, then you don't really know. And people don't like to question God. I was not somebody who wanted certainty all the time. And evangelicals want certainty. I wanted, the mess. And it was, I had already started off a process, and it was a Jesuit who really brought me back.
And who was that? Can I ask?
It was my friend, Jim Pratt.
Oh,
He is
sure.
now so we've talked about him before. He's deceased now. But it happened when I was at Vanderbilt as a student. And basically, we had I'm sorry, but hopefully he's listening to this. There's a priest from Canisius who used to come to the library, and I worked in the library when I was doing my doctorate. And I asked him one day, I said, I've been out of Catholicism for a while, but I want to think about coming back to Mass and everything. He's like, you never left, right? They didn't take your name off the rolls. We don't ever take names off the rolls unless we're going to, excommunicate somebody. I was like, well, that's good to know. And I had a couple of experiences that were not good experiences at evangelical churches in Nashville. And Jim came as the Catholic chaplain. And when he came as a chaplain, I will never forget this. So this was my spiritual experience, okay? My spiritual experience is probably going to read very differently than other people. I was walking down the hall one day, and it was All Saints Day, and he was about to do Mass, and we had this chapel that was named All Faith Chapel, but we colloquially called it No Faith Chapel. at Vanderbilt. And I looked down the hall. He's about to walk down the aisle. He looked at me and I looked at him. I said, I need to go to Mass. That's how it happened. And I came to Mass. I started spiritual direction with him. And then I thought after about 6 weeks, I was like, I think we're going to be friends. We probably should stop doing spiritual direction. And that's what happened.
That's a great, there's so much I want to explore, if you don't mind. First of all, you looked into his eyes and...
I don't know. God spoke to me, maybe. I don't
what
get it.
What were you feeling inside?
I just felt like I felt impelled to go in and go to Mass. I did. It was a very interesting feeling. It was like, I'm supposed to go to Mass today.
Let me back you up a little bit, if you don't mind.
No.
So you said in your 20s you were drawn to evangelicalism. So where are you in your life? You finished college and
I finished college, and then I had been active in the church and feeling like I had something to offer, right? Wanting to give something to people, right? And seeing people in pain and suffering and all of that. But there were a lot of people who were going to seminary, and I should probably just name the seminary because a lot of people know this already. It's Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, probably the big evangelical seminary, and very California in a lot of different ways. And that was a good place for me, but it was also an open place for me. And what I mean by that, it was a place open to questioning. And I found really good mentors there and people who were willing to talk to me. And one particular mentor that I had, Mel Robeck, had been involved in the Catholic Pentecostal dialogue. So I have to say this because it's really important to say the kind of people I had around me, because that was also part of it. So it actually happened that I was in one of his early church Christianity classes, his early church class, and we went over the Nicene Creed. I've been saying the Creed for years. Nobody explained this to me. You just say the Creed, right? And he broke it down, and I started crying in class because I was like, oh, finally, somebody is explaining this to me. And for me, this is actually a big part of being a Catholic, is that, there's a Catholicism of practice, but there's the Catholicism of intellect. And the Catholicism that some of us need is a Catholicism that is this huge tradition of scholars and intellects and everyone who are saying, this is why we do what we do. This is why it's homoousios instead of homoousion, right? And everybody just went, what the hell's that? But it's that. That's what got me.
You're right. So many Catholics don't know the tradition. And it's not because they're uninterested or they're ignorant or they're stupid. It's just no one's taught it to them. And so I find, I don't know what your experience is, sometimes when you present it to them, they're a little surprised and sometimes a little shocked and sometimes a little challenged and sometimes a little annoyed. Like,
Yes.
What are you talking about, Catholic social teaching? And what do you mean the Nicene Creed means this? And yeah, so I can sympathize with that.
Yeah, I'm sure you get that a lot because they want you to be the celebrity priest, right? They don't kind of want you to be this person who's like, I'm challenging you about your faith and asking you this question, right?
Yeah, or if you ask them a question, if you say this is part of our tradition, they say, no, you're making that up. Like the primacy of conscience, for example. No, you're making that stuff up. So I'm really interested. So you're in seminary, and then take us through the rest of after seminary.
After seminary, I go to Vanderbilt to do my
Right.
PhD. After everybody says, yeah, you should do this, you can really stretch. You can think things. And I go to do my PhD, which is actually, this will be the scary part. People know me as an American religion historian, but I actually am a 2,000-year church historian. So I can talk about origin and all of it. So that was an interesting time because there I was in the buckle of the Bible Belt, Nashville, right? And I had visited a couple of churches trying to figure out what to do. This was before my friend Jim Pratt came. And then I realized, I was like, this is not going to work for me because these people are not thinking. And it's the guy, my professor who ended up being my advisor took us to this Pentecostal church. And I remember there were two very big things that happened. We had somebody who was gay with us. And of course, the pastor started a diatribe about gays, right? And which was terrible. And that person was very offended. That was one. And then the second thing that happened is that towards the end of his sermon, he says, well, you don't need education. You just need the Holy Ghost. And I just thought, yeah, but the Holy Ghost can show up in education. And I'm not feeling you. And that was kind of my beginning of that was literally my first semester there. And I just thought, this is not going to work for me.
When you came back to Catholicism, were there things about the evangelical tradition that you missed?
I missed the interrogation of Scripture, I think, where people would ask questions about it. That's one. And I think the thing that I didn't miss, what I missed about evangelicalism was the ways in which people would get together. And I know people get together in parishes, and that eventually happened for me at Vanderbilt because we had a really robust Catholic community there. But I think that what I missed about it was that sense in which people were would call each other or do things. Sometimes I feel like in parishes, unless you're connected a certain way, that doesn't happen. You can feel very distant until you come to the Mass and you shake somebody's hand, but then you leave, right? So for all of that, that's what I missed, but I didn't miss all the rest of it. I didn't miss the judgmental stuff. And I also didn't like, and this is going to sound very strange to people, but I didn't like the way women were treated, and I didn't like the way that I was being treated. And there was one particular instance that, I had all these things that were leading up to me going back to the Catholic Church, but one big thing defined it. And that big thing that defined it was the World Council of Churches was having a big thing at Harare, and this was 1998. And I had been involved in an ecumenical dialogue between Reformed and Pentecostals. And the reason why I was on the Pentecostal side was because people knew I knew this very well from my studies, right? And it was my professor at Fuller who invited me. But I had got invited by the head of the World Council of Churches to go to Zimbabwe. And when I approached the denomination that I had been going to church in, Pentecostal church, they were like, we're going to send a pastor. And that to me was the immediate thing, was like, you know what? No, you don't care that I'm working on a PhD. You don't care anything about this. And so now I know that God is calling me elsewhere. And at the same time, literally 2 days later, I got a letter asking me to interview at the institution I got hired at, eventually Laurel and Marymount.
No, it's so much there. There's so much
I'm
there.
sorry, I'm giving you a lot.
No, I don't apologize. I think it's so interesting. One of the things I can imagine, some people saying is, well, gosh, in Catholicism, don't you feel, women's roles are, not where you want them to be, for example? Is that the same? Or
yeah, no, absolutely. I wish, Pope Francis had done more. I love Pope Francis, but I wish he had done more. That's number one. I think that's where he fell off. I will say that publicly. I hope that maybe the Synod, when the final results come out and all of this and Pope Leo decides to work on this, I think I can already see some changes that he's making that might be helpful. I never wanted to be a priest. I want to say this up front, and I'm not for the priest life. That's not me. I admire you for doing it. That would not be me. I also think that for women in the church, we've always known that women have been a very important piece of the Catholic Church. You don't have Marian devotion unless you understand the Catholic Church. You do not understand that. At the same time, I do think the church could be a lot better about women. I think that they could be a lot better about a lot of things. And, just like you have divorced people and laws have changed and all of that stuff, the church is like a big giant ship that you got to figure out how you're going to turn. And it's too big to just turn it fast. You can't turn it fast. And, I'm sure there are going to be people who'll be upset with me by saying this, but I think it will come. It may not come in my lifetime, but I think it will come. And it will have to come out of necessity, because the necessity is that you're not going to have enough people taking vocations.
Well, and I think that image of the ship is a really important one. And the bark of Peter and all that. When I was at the Synod, one of the things, I don't know if we've talked about this before, one of the things that I had a little bit of a conversion on was I'm pretty impatient. I want things to be done immediately. And I think I used to think that if I sat down in front of somebody and just, shared and not convinced, but they'd change. Yeah. And I was talking especially about LGBTQ issues and women's issues and whatnot. And you could sit down with the delegate and, talk to your blue in the face and share a story and be disclosive and share your emotions. And, they're still where they were. And I remember thinking, I have a whole lot of sympathy for Pope Francis, who was trying to move the church ahead, and for Pope Leo now too, but also not go so fast, right, that you break off. It's really, and I have to say, before I went over, I would have said, no, it's all about prophecy and truth and all that, and people should catch up, but it's not. And you have to, in a sense, sort of accept that as a Catholic, which is tough. I think that's tough for a lot of people, particularly in the U.S. and in the West, to accept.
Yeah. You have to accept that bureaucracy moves slow. And the Catholic Church is a big, giant bureaucracy, whether people like it or not. It really is. And that, I think in that sense, we can't expect it to turn overnight, but we can't expect the voices like yours and mine who keep saying, you need to change this, it's not going to work out, that continue to clamor.
Do you feel welcome as a Black woman in the Catholic Church, maybe in your parish or in the church in general?
Mostly, yes, because I pick and choose where I go, right? And I travel a lot. I think I don't feel different because I know that I come in to a liturgy that everybody is having, whether that's in the language that I understand or not, right? And that I feel comfortable where I am because I am who I am, right? But I know for a lot of people that's not the case. And I'm thinking especially now where we have, at least in America, so many political divides. It depends on what parish you're going to, whether or not you fit in. And I think, there are some parishes that I would never go to right now because I know I don't politically fit in. I know that they may not be what I think about immigrants, and they may not be where I think about social justice, even though those are Catholic teachings. They may not be there. And so I think that's a space for me that I try to navigate.
Yeah, one of the most powerful stories I've ever heard. You probably know him, Ralph McLeod. Do you know that name?
Yes, I do.
So he was head of Catholic Campaign for Human Development. I will never forget this. And he said this publicly, so I can say it. So Ralph, who's African-American, was at Georgetown. We were at a conference. And he traveled a lot for his job, for the bishops' conference. And he was at some place, and one Sunday morning, he looked up the parish, the local parish, and, as one does when one is traveling. And he goes in the door, and it's all white, basically. And the pastor comes up to him and says, "Oh, hi, excuse me, this is a Catholic parish, right?"
Mm-hmm.
And Ralph said, "I do. Do you know that this is a Catholic parish?"
That's good.
So,
yeah.
Let me ask you, in terms of your background in evangelicalism, one of the things I'm dying to ask you, when you look at the Catholic Church today in the United States, do you see kind of strains of evangelical thinking in the church? And how would you describe it, and what's your reaction to it?
Can I pick on somebody really big right now?
Okay.
I want to talk about J.D. Vance. And the whole thing, the dust up about Ordo Amoris, that whole description he gave was an evangelical description of how they think about the family. It was not Catholic. And I was like, the first thing I thought was, he's got a convert. And I'm not against converts. Let me just say this up front. But it was a question of teaching. He didn't know it. And he voiced something that was evangelical instead of Catholic. And I think that's true for a lot of Catholics. I think that they pick up the things that are out here in public about evangelicalism. And granted, we have a lot of Catholics who listen to evangelical preachers, right? And they pick up these things that are evangelical theology, and they're not Catholic at all. And they don't even know their own tradition. This is where I get back to the intellectual piece of just knowing what your tradition is, right? Because if you know it, then you don't have to think about what this other stuff is. You can engage with it, but you have to know how to discern. And I think discernment is really important.
Well, let's unpack that for our listeners and our viewers. So J.D. Vance talked about the Ordo Amoris, which is based on Aquinas and Augustine, and this idea that basically we start with love of those closest to us, and then we expand out as he defined it, or as he described it. How would you look at that from a Catholic point of view?
From a Catholic point of view, I feel like you should probably understand this the way that it's supposed to be understood. We love God, and then we move down, right? But I think for evangelicals, it's all like, the head of the household is the father, and then you have the family, and then God's over all of that. But it's a different kind of inversion, right? And there's a culture right now in American Catholicism that looks very much like American Evangelicalism to me.
That is very insightful. Yeah, there is something in American culture that I think wants, I would say, clear answers, black and white answers. And, I think when you look at like the Ordo Amoris, and you're encouraged to instead look at, or in addition, look at like the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is about, obviously the opposite. It's about taking care of someone who's a complete stranger, right? And is supposed to be kind of an enemy, the Jews and the Samaritans. I think what's a struggle for a lot of Catholics is that, that's about mystery. And I mean, the parables are supposed to kind of, as C.H. Dodd said, tease your mind into active thought. It's not about, here are the 10 things to make up a neighbor, and here are the limits, And I think Catholics are sometimes really uncomfortable with the mystery. And I think that's really insightful. Let me ask you something about, this is something I've been thinking about a lot. Do you think that converts are, at the Easter Vigil, we celebrate people.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah. Do you think they're respected or denigrated? Because I've heard people, kind of dismiss them. Let me put that in context for our listeners. Like, oh, well, they shouldn't critique the church because, they've only been, Catholic for a couple of years. Or, you've had kind of a unique experience, kind of, leaving and coming back. What's your take on that?
As somebody who's kind of made jokes about this, I will confess and ask for absolution here, first of all.
I have to give it to you, of course.
Yeah, you have to give it to me because I'm here, right? But, I think the thing about converts is that this is a massive thing to learn. And when you're trying to figure it out, you want the natural thing as a human being to do is want to compare it to something that you know. And you can't compare this to something if you come in for the first time. I think about, I took a friend through RCIA a few years ago. It's probably been more than 10 years ago. And it was really interesting talking to her because she was trying to put this against her evangelical upbringing, right? She was Korean. And so that was a whole different thing, because we were moving through shamanism and Korean and then Catholic Church. The Catholic Church actually made more sense to her in certain kinds of ways. But there were things that she thought that were sort of like, I don't know. And we kind of worked through that. And I think sometimes for converts, the zeal of wanting to be in is always the front and center thing for them, because they know it's like, I wasn't born this way. I didn't get, that like me, got baptized literally within 3 weeks of being born. That didn't happen for them, but they had to come through it another way. And there was something they found about the Catholic Church that was beautiful and right and spoke to them spiritually, right?
Let's shift a little bit. Let's talk about your own personal spiritual practices today. Prayer, going to mass. What do you do that helps you stay grounded and connected to God?
But
You're terrible? In what way?
No, I mean that I am not like my mother. I am not like my mother's friends. I am not like one of my friends' parents who used to go to mass every day. That's not where I get it from. I get it in reading. I get it through quiet moments. Sometimes I'm sitting outside looking at birds and I'm like, okay, that's God speaking to me about something, right? And I think the reason why I have always been attracted to Jesuit spirituality and Ignatian spirituality more specifically is because there's a way in which you can be in motion and be spiritual.
What a great way of saying it. Yeah, contemplative in action.
Yeah, you all don't spend a whole bunch of time praying. That's why I like going to Jesuit masses. Just 45 minutes, you're done.
we're supposed to.
Yeah, you're supposed to, but you don't,
right?
But it's the active being of, it's not that I'm going to put this spirituality in the corner, I'm going to pray my rosary or whatever, and do this in the corner, and then I'm going to come out and do everything else. I think it's something you think about all the time. I hadn't been to Rome since 2015, and I went this time for the, election. One of the things that was really moving to me, and I don't remember this in 2015 when I was there, but maybe I wasn't there at night. I was walking out after, it happened. The election happened on that Thursday night, and it was into Friday morning. I was leaving at 1:00 in the morning to go back to my place. And I saw all these people sleeping around the Vatican. And I thought, this is really bad. But then the other part of it, I was like, maybe it's okay that they are closer to God here than someplace else, and that they can sleep in these niches. And I don't want people to misunderstand this. I'm not saying that we shouldn't house the homeless. I want the homeless to be housed. But I felt like that was a place where they could be, and that I saw Jesus there in a different way than I would have sitting in a mass.
Yeah, I always remark about that. For people who don't know, they've probably seen the pictures of, even if you've not been there, St. Peter's, there's the colonnades, Bernini's colonnades, and that's where a lot of the homeless are. And I mean, one of the things we should say is that, the Vatican has homeless shelters, and there's places for refugees, and Pope Francis would bring them in for meals and things. But it was striking to pass them by every morning on the way to the Synod, right? And see them every morning. And that was a visual reminder, right, of really who we're supposed to be looking out for.
Yeah. And it's also that for me, I just have to say about it like this. It's like, for me, the stories of Catholicism, I have a friend who would say this to me, and she's going to listen to this podcast and she'll know I'm talking about her. She says, liberation theology is dead, right? And in some ways I might agree, but in other ways I don't, because I just think about, we have to continue to have a preferential option for the poor. And that's the problem right now. We don't have a preferential option for the poor. We don't care about the poor. We don't care about the migrants. We don't care about the immigrants. We have gone into this, I think one of the worst things about evangelicals and Pentecostals right now has been the embrace of the prosperity gospel.
Yes.
And that's not to say that people shouldn't have money. It's just to say that the prosperity gospel has killed our, empathy for people who don't have. And I always want to think about that and think that I have been blessed because I have something, but therefore the grace of God go I. I could be that person sleeping in the colonnades or, out wandering in the wilderness or something and not having something. And I think, to me, that's the part of Catholic teaching that I want to see so much more emphasized, and why I think about justice all of the time is because we need to have that preferential option for the poor. We need to think about people who are abused. We need to think about people who are downtrodden. It's why, and I will bring this up, when I came back to the Catholic Church, one of the biggest things that I wrote about a lot which has gotten me into trouble with people, is about sexual abuse, because I knew people who had been sexually abused in the Catholic Church. And I choose to stay not because I condone that, but I choose to stay because I want to fight that. And I want to fight for people who have been abused and downtrodden. And that, to me, is where my spirituality is.
Well, I think you're right. And I think I want to bring you back to the prosperity gospel, because I have never understood how that can be accepted. Because, I mean, essentially means that if you believe in God and you live a good life, you're going to be rewarded. And of course, that encourages, as you were saying, people to say, well, if these people aren't rewarded, then somehow they're bad, they're not believing. But I'm always amazed, and I'm curious what you would say about this. People who believe in that must look at people and must see people in their families who are holy and devout and prayerful and charitable, who get cancer or who lose their jobs. And I've never understood the kind of intellectual leap you have to make.
I'm going to give it to you right now. Here's the intellectual leap. You didn't have enough faith. Your faith was not strong enough to combat cancer. Your faith was not strong enough to combat foreclosure. You should have believed God, that God was going to give you this money, and you should have given to this evangelist or this, televangelist, and that you'll get that money. That's how this works. It's a never-ending cycle, because what happens to you in prosperity is that you're always having to give more, but you're getting less. And you're not giving in the right place, first of all. It's basically like, I would call, and you know this because you went to Wharton, this is like a stockbroker program for God. You pay in and you hope that your stock is going to go up, right? But unfortunately, what we've had in this country is that illness is almost looked at that. And we can think about this right now with everything being stripped from healthcare that we barely have in this country. And now what you have is that people are saying, well, you don't need these shots. You don't need all this stuff, because what they're talking about is basically two things. One is prosperity gospel, and then the survival for the fittest. And so if you're not part of this particular structure, then, if you get sick and you die, that's on you.
Well, it's very transactional, too.
Yes.
And, I always look at, I think it's John 9. I'm not very good in the Bible citations, but, where Jesus meets the man born blind.
Yeah.
Right? And they ask, who sinned that this man was born blind? No one sinned,
No
right?
one sinned.
And, there are so many verses, even for, people who are fundamentalists, to see in the gospel that just doesn't work. Would you say that the impetus for the prosperity gospel is not wanting to, face people who are poor? Do you think the impetus is, I just want to do well myself? Because it really, and I don't want to denigrate people, but it really takes a lot to kind of look in the Gospels and come out with the prosperity gospel. So what is the impetus? Where does that all come from?
Well, there's a whole class I teach on this, but let me give you the short version.
Sure.
They don't want to suffer. And suffering is hard, as you know, right? And I think that the impetus comes from, it really starts in the 19th century. But if we think about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism by Weber, right? I have a class called God and Money. You would have taken it.
I would have loved to have taken that. And I read that book at Wharton. Yeah,
you did. And somebody taught it. And I think it's really important to think about, because there's an ethical involvement, and people think that they work hard, they will get rich, or they'll get, what they put in, you get out, right? So transactional, as you say, right? And I think part of it for people now is about, we have such a, let's put it like this. In the last 20, 30, 40 years, what has happened in this country is that we have a lot of religious people who have a lot of money. And you can see that, right? And you can see it in the ways in which they dress. So we have people like this in the Catholic Church too, but I'm thinking mostly about televangelists, evangelicals, Pentecostals. And you see this out in public, and you can be this person. And so now that we have an administration that has all these people, and you see the money and you see the power and you see who has the power and authority, then it's not too far-fetched for people to believe, who come here and hoping for a better life, that they can attain these things too, right? It's aspirational. And aspiration and religion put together is very interesting, because it can create some big mess.
Yeah, it's very seductive too.
Yes, very much so.
I mean, the idea that all I got to do is believe in certain things.
Yeah, and I'll get it.
We have questions from our audience. So here's the question from Mary. How can one align their faith and practice as Jesus so clearly did in the Gospels? What would you say to that?
What is it that aligns with your faith? What do you care about in the Gospels? Is the story about the Syrophoenician woman, or there's a story about, immigration? Is the story about, friendship? All of these stories that are in the gospel, I think, point to things that you can align yourself with faith and justice. Are you worried about people not having food? How are you going to feed all these people? Do you go work at the food bank? Do you care about justice? Do you care about the centurion who's there next to Jesus? And I care about, police justice, right? So I care about people who have been unjustly accused. That story resonates with me so much about Jesus, because here's somebody who had to face, a court, was tried unjustly, sentenced to death. Do you care about the death penalty? There are ways in which you can read the Gospels through another lens altogether. If you look at the life of Jesus, Jesus is telling you everything he's doing has something to do with everyday life. And if you read it just like it's just a spiritual thing, you've missed the point.
That is a great answer. Thank you. And Anthea Butler, thank you for coming in. Thank you for joining us. And really, thank you for sharing your spiritual life with us today.
You're welcome.
Well, I could have listened to her all day.
I know. I could have listened to you both speak all day. She was such an interesting guest to have on the show. Most notably, she had this term, Catholicism of intellect, the kind of questioning, reading, thinking, critical thinking that animates her faith. Not to say we haven't had intellectual Catholics on the show before, but did you find that a surprise or interesting, Jim?
I was delighted she brought it up, because I've often thought that, many people have had the same experience that I had, which is, I went to high school and college, and I think I was fairly well educated, but I didn't know much about the Catholic history or the church history or Catholic social teaching or the Gospels. And I think if you don't go to a Catholic school, or you don't sort of specifically avail yourself of that, it's hard to get.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah, the average intelligent Catholic may not get that. You're not supposed to be getting it from the Gospels. You're not supposed to be strictly catechetical. And so we're going to learn that stuff. And so I think she's right. And I think when a lot of Catholics are faced with that, or they encounter it, right, a more gentle word, they say, where did this come from? And, are people making it up? And why didn't I hear about this before? And sometimes they're challenged, as I was saying. Sometimes they're annoyed, right? What are you talking about, Catholic social teaching? So I think she's absolutely right. And I think she's done a very good job in her own life and her own scholarly work of, trying to make that accessible for people. So I, in a sense, I feel the church, hasn't figured out how to educate Catholics outside of Catholic schools and, Catholic colleges. So yeah, I was glad she brought that up.
I know when I started taking religious studies classes at Santa Clara, I was actually delighted to hear that there was this Catholic wisdom tradition. When was the first time that you encountered it, and were you delighted or annoyed?
I was, it wasn't until after I entered the Jesuits. I mean, I didn't know any of this stuff. I mean, I knew the Gospels, and I'd watched Jesus of Nazareth on TV, and I went to Mass, pretty much every Sunday. But, learning about the mystics and the church fathers and, 2,000 years of church history, it wasn't until I entered the Jesuits. And it's still really, I don't think it was really until my philosophy studies or theology studies that I was, sort of introduced to it. So I think she's right. I think that hinders the church in its movement, because, many people, again, not out of, ignorance or a sort of rejection of it, just because they've not been presented with it. They don't know this tradition. So I think anything we can do, and that's one of the things we do at America Media, we try to open people up to this.
Yeah.
I also thought I was so interested in her spiritual journey, that move from Catholic to evangelical to Catholic. I don't know anyone that has gone through that. I mean, what struck you about her kind of journey?
Well, what struck me most is the role that other people played throughout her journey. She talked about some key people at Fuller Theological Seminary. She also talked about Jim Pratt. Maybe you could share with us briefly who Jim Pratt is. I'm not familiar with him.
Yeah, sure. Jim Pratt was a friend. He was a Jesuit from what used to be called the New England province of the Society of Jesus. Now we're all the East Coast province. And was at Vanderbilt, as she said, which is where Anthea encountered him, and then died very young of cancer, as I recall, but a really nice guy. I was thinking when she was talking about Jim, that's the perfect Jesuit for her to encounter. Very open, very funny, very much an academic too. So yeah, no, it was nice to be reminded of him.
I think this idea of other people being conduits of God's grace is pretty Catholic. Even if you don't learn the bread and butter catechism as thoroughly as you could have, that the church has this understanding of real community, and that we are to one another, or have the opportunity to be the body of Christ.
Yeah, and that story about the two of them, kind of locking eyes. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, that was kind of mystical.
Yeah, and just so unique. So I love that kind of detail in people's lives, people's spiritual lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's great.